Greetings, Excellencies, Indigenous peoples, representatives, colleagues and friends. Thanks once again for the trust bestowed in us as the advisors to the President to assist in this very important objective of enhancing Indigenous peoples' participation in the United Nations.
The reason for going to the United Nations is to participate in consultations that they're having with Indigenous communities from around the world. And the purpose of the consultations is to establish a process where Indigenous communities can participate at the UN. That's not to say that Indigenous people don't already participate at the UN, but Indigenous governments, as we would call them, do not have an avenue of participation. And as sovereign nations, we believe that we should have that right to participate at the UN and have a seat at the table with those other countries from around the world. So we've been going up there, participating in consultations, talking about how we believe the process should be, from anything from who is eligible to participate in the process, to a selection mechanism, to where within the UN those who are selected can participate, what documents we can submit or what we can comment on, can we vote, can we not, and all that sort of thing. So it's been a pretty wide variety of conversation taking place.
So we're hoping to get to a point where Indigenous peoples can see a draft resolution and comment on specifics of that resolution so that it's as strong as we can get it before it gets to that stage of intergovernmental negotiation. I think typically the General Assembly likes to have some resolutions shaped by June, and then by the whole process, something has to be finalized and adopted. And that's a mandate that was given to the President of the General Assembly in a General Assembly resolution from 2015. So a resolution, has to be finalized and adopted by the end of this current session that we're in, which concludes on September 11th.
The committee should consider evidence and views from all relevant sources. State recognition should be a consideration for accreditation, but cannot be a necessary criterion. Recognition by other Indigenous peoples, however, can serve as some evidence that an Indigenous governing institution is genuine and entitled to participate in the United Nations.
Now, these operative paragraphs state that the measures should be formulated and adopted while taking into account the views of Indigenous peoples, and we appreciate the convening of this series of discussions that enable us to take that role as anticipated and as stated throughout the process, very important.
Recognizing that the situation varies from region to region and taking into account various historical and cultural backgrounds. We are also of the view that a definition of Indigenous peoples and a no objection clause are not appropriate nor necessary.
Well, the question there is really about how Indigenous peoples can participate in the UN. What is their status? The UN itself is a closed body composed of member states. So countries like the United States, France, Great Britain, they're the members of the United Nations, and they come and they have the right to speak, to make proposals, to submit written documentation to the UN, to shape the debate, and to take votes on what the UN is going to do. Other bodies, other entities, have the capacity to come into the United Nations and watch, to submit some written documents, to make some oral statements at certain times. And one of the ways the UN facilitates that is by designating bodies as observers. So something like the Holy See is not a member state of the United Nations, but they're what's called a permanent observer to the UN. And that gives them a status to come into meetings, to make oral statements, submit documents, talk to other members, and influence the debate that way. They don't get to vote, they don't get to make proposals the way that the United States can, but they're able to do more than simply sit in the very back of the room and look passively on. Right now, the way it's set up, Indigenous governments, or tribal governments, can't even do that much. They can't even get into the back of the room in many of these meetings because the UN doesn't grant them any sort of status to participate. So this process is about creating, as KARLA said, creating space for our Indigenous governments, our tribal governments, to come to the UN and present their concerns to the global community.
So the word tribe was devised to diminish our status And so we certainly don't accept that term. Tribes is something less than a nation-to-nation kind of relationship. So when the U.S. government wanted to make all Indigenous peoples citizens of the U.S., and they offered us citizenship, our nation rejected that. And so you're going to see the difference between a lot of nations that will call themselves nations versus tribes that have now come under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And we don't accept any federal funding. And so we're very autonomous and sovereign. We have our own businesses, and we have our own, within our community, we have our own programs that you would see in any other nation.
I come from the Navajo Nation. As I told you yesterday, I am its first ambassador. Years and years ago, the federal government put out a law to the Indian people in the 1930s, and they wanted to set the criteria as to their definition of what a government is. And it had all the attributes of what the United States Constitution produced as the way the government should look, what they should exercise, and all of that. And when that idea, the law that was promulgated by the federal government, they gave the opportunity for the Indian people to make comments on, and whether they should accept that, what is being given to them and recommended by the federal government. Navajo Nation, the Navajo people, rejected. We were very few that rejected that by saying, this is our own tribal government. It predates Columbus. It predates the United States. That's the way we govern ourselves, and that's the way we want to continue to govern ourselves. I think in the process of considering these applicants, that should be considered. Just because a nation like the United States says that this should be the way the Indian people live and to govern themselves, that doesn't mean that we have to accept that. We rejected that and now continue to this day. We do not have a constitution, but we govern ourselves. It works for us. It does the job of the need to govern ourselves. As long as those kinds of attributes are in place, I believe the people who will be making those kinds of decisions has to recognize that. And I just wanted to say that and thank you for the opportunity to talk.
So I think the end goal, once we achieve this level of participation, the end goal ultimately has to be an increased awareness of sovereignty and who we are as a nation of people. You know, if you look back throughout our history, there are times when we were recognized as a sovereign and recognized as a legitimate nation by European countries. And then, you know, it seems, you know, more recent years, the question is do these countries still recognize us? We have treaties with these countries that, you know, maybe, you know, 200 years old now, but, you know, do they still recognize us as a sovereign nation? And so I think the end goal ultimately has to be that increased awareness and that solidifying, you know, who we are on a global scale and you know, reestablishing those connections with some of those countries that we've been connected with in the past, and new relationships, relationships that could lead to a number of things. Maybe it's trade, maybe it's educational exchanges with high school students or college students, or cultural exchanges, or, you know, who knows what, business opportunities. There's all kinds of things that could come out of these relationships. So I think that ultimately has to be our goal, is to establish some of those things.
Well, I think in part it's that, you know, our tribal governments have a lot of priorities and a lot of pressing concerns. And working at the UN, as you know, like KARLA was saying, we've been doing this. Our tribal nations have been doing this for almost 100 years now, trying to get onto the international stage. And those sorts of very long-term projects, it can be difficult to get our tribal governments to engage on projects that have such long-term prospects. That said, it's also the case that tribal governments have been involved heavily in this UN work, in working on the World Conference in the lead up to that. The World Conference was held in 2014, and we started really working on that in 2012. And, we had groups of, 70, 80, 90, 100 U.S. Tribes participating in that at some level, at least to the level of making statements, signing on to statements, coming to some meetings. And today, at this meeting, I think we have, how many tribal governments are here this week, do you think? 8, 12, something like that?
10 or 12.
So tribes are engaged, and as this process gets closer to, as we start to see a product at the end of it, as we see that this resolution is going to happen, I expect that we'll see more and more tribes taking time and spending the resources and putting their people on the ground here at the UN to make their case, to talk to states and advocate for their interests.